Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakuyo, and I'd like to welcome you to an episode of Dharma Sunday, where I take canonical Buddhist teachings and tie it to everyday life. The title of today's talk is, Should Buddhists Engage in Politics? But before we get into that, please like and subscribe. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. Also, please be aware these teachings are offered for free. However, if you'd like contribution to support my ministry, information for that is in the description below. Finally, if you'd like to do a deep dive into Buddhist training, please check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. There's a link to a sample chapter of the book in the description for this talk. So about this subject a lot lately, and I thought it was an important one to discuss given the political temperature of our times and the things that are happening right now in our country, which, sorry, kitty wants attention, which culminated in a riot that happened last week where rioters stormed the Capitol building and 60 police officers were wounded, 5 people have been killed. And the question becomes for us as Buddhists, how do we deal with this? Should we deal with this? Should we be involved with politics at all? And to answer that question, I think we first need to look at the question of what is politics? What is political discussion? What is the Dharma? So when we talk about the Dharma, first, obviously, we're talking about Buddhism, the Buddha Dharma, the chanting, the meditation, the bowing, the systematic approach that's designed to allow us to realize enlightenment. But beyond that, we're taught that a Dharma is simply an aspect of truth or reality. The cat is a Dharma, the plants are Dharma, these robes are Dharmas. So everything is an aspect of truth and reality. Everything has the possibility to teach us Buddhism and help us realize enlightenment. The question is, how do we work with that Dharma skillfully? All Dharmas are either good, neutral, or bad, according to Buddhism, which essentially means that they're either good and we should get as much as we can, they're neutral and we just need to work with them skillfully, or they're bad and we should avoid them altogether. You can think of it like plants. Some plants we eat, some plants we don't eat, they're poisonous, and others we eat, but only after they've been prepared, cooked, let's say. So where does the Dharma of politics fall into play? Well, I think we've seen what happens when people go too much into politics, and they think this is the end-all and be-all of their existence. That's what happened last week at the Capitol. So I don't think it's right to say that politics are good. At the same time, we can't avoid politics altogether. They're everywhere. They're in our sports, they're in our news, they're in our family discussions. So even if we do think politics are bad, they're not avoidable. Therefore, politics is a Dharma that's neutral, which means there's something we have to deal with, and we have to deal with skillfully. So how do we do that? How do we work skillfully with the Dharma of politics? Well, the Buddha, in his wisdom, gave us some guidance here in the Pali Canon, and I'll read a few passages and then I'll comment on them. The first one comes from Samantabhadra Sutta, the fruits of the contemplative life. And in it, Buddha says, whereas some Brahmins and contemplatives living off food given in faith are addicted to talking about lowly topics such as these, talking about kings, robbers, ministers of state, armies, alarms, and battles, food and drink, clothing, furniture, garlands, and scents, relatives, vehicles, villages, towns, cities, the countryside, women and heroes, the gossip of the street and the well, tales of the dead, tales of diversity, philosophical discussions of the past and future, the creation of the world and of the sea, and talk of whether things exist or not. He abstains from talking about lowly topics such as these. This too is part of his virtue. So it seems here that Buddha is saying that we should avoid political discussion, robbers, ministers, states, armies, alarms, kings, that they're lowly, that they're not worth our time. And yet in the Kunda Kamaraputa Sutta, or the Kunda, or a discussion he has with Kunda the silversmith, he says, and how is one made pure in 4 ways by verbal action? There is the case where a certain person abandoning false speech abstains from false speech. When he has been called to a town meeting, a group meeting, a gathering of his relatives, his guild, or of the royalty, if he is asked as a witness, come and tell, good man, what you know. If he doesn't know, he says, I don't know. If he does know, he says, I know. If he hasn't seen, he says, I haven't seen. If he has seen, he says, I have seen. Thus, he doesn't consciously tell a lie for his own sake, for the sake of another, or for the sake of any reward. Abandoning false speech, he abstains from false speech. So here, it seems like Buddha is giving us very clear instructions on what we should do if we choose to engage in politics. In this case, he's saying that we should tell the truth and that speech. So which is it? Should we avoid politics altogether, or should we engage in politics in a way that's in accordance with the Dharma? Well, my view is that Buddha is telling us, ideally, we should not engage in politics, that it's lowly, that it brings out the worst in us. I think anyone who's looked at the news can probably agree with that. But he's also saying that Buddhist morality transcends politics, meaning that if we choose to, or if we must engage in political discussion, in politics, we should do so in a way that's in accordance with Buddhist practice, that's in accordance with the Dharma. So we here in the West, unfortunately, are in a place where we can't avoid political discussion, like I said, everywhere, and it's affecting us. Everyone who's been affected by the protests and the riots of the past year and the pandemic knows that. So if we're surrounded by politics, if we can't escape it, what Buddha is saying is that we have to engage with it skillfully in a way that's in accordance with the practice. And he gives similar teachings throughout the sutras. He says that we shouldn't work with ministers, with kings, that we shouldn't run messages for them. But at the same time, in the Nirvana Sutra, when he was about to die and pass into parinirvana, it was kings and ministers, amongst others, who brought him the largest offerings. He gave some of his most famous teachings to members of royalty, to members of the state. So again, if we can't avoid politics, if it's something we choose to engage in or we must engage in, we have to do so in keeping with Buddhist teachings. And to give you an example of how this works from real life, when I was working on a farm in upstate New York, I was the apprentice, and it was my job to, amongst other things, take care of and raise our chickens. And they were in a field surrounded by an electric fence, and they went about their day, and there was a coyote who I saw in the distance, and he never came close, but I always saw him moving around in the forest on the edge of the field, but never coming into it. And essentially, I didn't pay the coyote any mind. I actually thought it was kind of cool that he was there. But one day, something happened. I just happened to be working in the greenhouse, which was near the chickens, and I heard this loud commotion. So I run out there to see what's happening, and I see the coyote trying to get into the chicken coop. He's like testing the edges of the electric fence, trying to get inside. The chickens see him, they're going insane. And in that moment, I had to make a decision. I didn't wish the coyote any harm. Like I said, I thought he was kind of cool. But I was responsible for caring for these chickens. And the farm owner would have been really, really upset if I told her I allowed the coyote to eat the chickens because I didn't want to get involved. So what I did instead is I picked up a stick and metal lid to a trash can. I ran at the coyote and I banged the lid as hard as I could. Made a lot of noise. I scared him off. And I have no idea what happened to him at that point. I never saw him again. But I think that's a good idea of how Buddhists approach politics, is that we don't necessarily want to be involved in the political sphere. Like I said, I think it brings out the worst in us, but there are times where we have to be involved, where the teachings of wisdom, where the teachings of compassion require us to be involved, not just for our good, but for the good of all sentient beings. So what do we do in those times? How can we get involved and still keep our vow to save all sentient beings from suffering? Well, in my study of the practice, I found that there are 3 things we can do that if we study these things and keep them in mind, they keep us from being pulled into the pit that can be political discussion. And one is the teaching of universal Buddhahood. We have to remember that all beings are Buddha, regardless of their political affiliation. And we see this again in the sutras. Buddha taught kings and queens. He also taught serial killers. He taught people who had done terrible things, and through his practice, he converted them to the Dharma to save all sentient beings. So what that means is for us is that anyone, regardless of their political persuasion, is a Buddha. And we have to remember that. Because if we don't, if we get caught up in our desires of we want this person to be elected, we want this rule or this law to pass, what happens is we forget that Buddhahood. And then we get pulled into greed, into anger, into ignorance. And then we do things like lie in order to gain the things we want. But if we keep our eye on the Buddha that is in every person, including ourselves, then we won't do that. We'll do what we need to do out of compassion and wisdom, but we won't do it out of hate. We won't do it out of anger. I protected the chickens, but I had no ill will towards the coyote. We can hold to our own political views without hating or being disgusted by the people on the other side if we hold to the view of universal Buddhahood. And if we're having trouble doing that, what I always say is if you can't love the person, love the Buddha inside of them. All of this is a facade. All of this is an illusion. Politics is an illusion. Only Buddha is real. And if we can't love the person in front of us, we should love the Buddha inside of them, because that's what really counts. The second item is right speech. And this is what Buddha alluded to earlier. Ideally, we don't want to be involved in politics, but if you are going to be involved in politics, practice right speech. Speak words of wisdom. Speak words of compassion. A good rule of thumb I like to keep for myself is, are my words in accordance with the bodhisattva vows? Sentient beings are numberless. I'll save them. Am I using my words in a way to save sentient beings, or am I using them to hurt sentient beings? Delusions are endless. I'll see through them. Am I using my words in a way that heals people and brings them together to unify them? Or am I creating division? Am I feeding the illusion of a separate self that causes all of the problems to begin with? The teachings are infinite. I'll learn them. As I study the sutras, what I'm saying, what I'm doing, is this in keeping with the Buddhist teaching? Is it in keeping with the passages I read earlier, with the other passages we go over during meditation and sutra study? If I don't know what to do in a situation, I should look to the sutras and to the Dharma for guidance. And finally, the Buddha way is difficult. I'll walk the path. And that's simply an act of humility, to admit that this is hard, that we are human beings, that we are nirmanakaya, that we are given to greed, anger, and ignorance, that we are of a nature to be born, to age, to get sick, and to die. And thus, we are not always the bad guy. We're not always the bad guy, and we're also not always the good guy. So before we look out and call out and check other people on their actions, it's always good to check ourselves first. Am I doing the right thing? Could I be doing it better? And then also offer that grace to other people as well. This is especially true online, where trolling has become a bit of an art form. This person said something hurtful. They said something I don't like. But this path is hard, and none of us are perfect. So if I'm struggling with right speech, if I'm struggling to remember universal Buddhahood, maybe they're struggling too. And right action, we'll do one more. And right action in Buddhism is simply, again, going back to the bodhisattva vows. Are my actions in keeping with these vows? Am I working in a way to help people or hurt people? Again, said, Buddhist morality transcends politics. Beating people up, killing people, destroying property, sending death threats. None of that is in keeping with Buddhist teachings. None of it. We do not subscribe to a practice that says the ends justify the means. If we don't have something nice to say about someone, if we can't bring ourselves to help that person, it's better to just leave it alone. That's the practice of right action. And we see this again in Buddha's life, where his homeland was invaded 4 times. His clan, the Shakya clan, was wiped out. Now, he was a prince. He could have raised an army to try to defend his people. He chose not to. He spoke with the king who was trying to fight his clan 3 times and tried to resolve the issue peacefully. And when he couldn't do that, he left the battlefield. Because the Dharma was more important than politics to the Buddha. Right action was more important than politics. And so it must be more important to us as well. So if we keep those 3 things in mind, universal Buddhahood, right speech, and right action, we'll be able to engage in a politics that's also in keeping with the teachings of the Buddha. And in this way, we can both do what needs to be done to take care of our conventional phenomenal selves, but also do what needs to be done so that we can realize enlightenment, not just for ourselves, but also for other people. And in closing, I'd like to read a passage from the Vimalakirti Sutra. This is from the BDK English Tripitaka translation. And in it, one of Buddha's attendants, Shariputra, speaking with Vimalakirti, who's a lay person, meaning he's not a monk, but he's also deeply realized, to the point that when he speaks with monks, they call him retired scholar, which was an honorific in that time. And Shariputra asked Vimalakirti, what land did you die in before you were reborn in this one? In other words, he's speaking about rebirth, and he's asking Vimalakirti, where were you before you came to this defiled Saha world? What was your life like? And Vimalakirti, is kind of a grumpy guy, so he doesn't want to answer it first. So then Buddha answers. And this is his response. Then the Buddha told Shariputra, there is a country called Wondrous Joy, Abhirati, where the Buddha is entitled Asobhya Immovable. Vimalakirti died in that country prior to be born here. Shariputra said, this is unprecedented, world-honored one. This person is able to forsake a pure land and come take pleasure in this place of great anger and harm. Vimalakirti said to Shariputra, what do you think? When the sun's light appears, is it conjoined with darkness? Shariputra answered, no. When the sun's light appears, the darkness disappears. Vimalakirti said, why does the sun come to Jambudvipa? Shariputra answered, to illuminate it and eliminate the darkness. Vimalakirti said, bodhisattvas are like this. Even though they are born in impure Buddha lands, in order to convert sentient beings, they are not therefore conjoined with the darkness of stupidity. They merely extinguish the darkness of the afflictions of sentient beings. So what Vimalakirti is saying in that passage is that bodhisattvas don't just stay in their pure lands forever. They don't just live there and live in bliss and do nothing. They leave their pure lands and they go to defiled lands to save sentient beings from suffering. And through their practice, they illuminate the darkness. They are surrounded by defilements, but themselves do not become defiled. Rather, they set an example. They become image bearers for the Dharma, so that other people can be drawn into the light. And I think that's such a good summation of the Buddhist worldview when it comes to politics, is that we as spiritual practitioners may want to simply live in our temples and our monasteries and not engage with the rest of the world. We want to stay in our pure lands, which is a very natural, very human reaction. I feel that way too sometimes. But what Vimalakirti says is, in order for us to keep with the bodhisattva vows to save all sentient beings from suffering, we don't stay in our pure lands forever. We leave them and we go into defiled lands. We go into this Saha world. We go into politics and we become the light. And as we become the light through our practice, we don't conjoin with the darkness, we extinguish it. We don't get drawn into the stupidity of media pundits. Rather, we extinguish it. We set a good example that others can follow. So this is true metaphysically when we're talking about rebirth and Vimalakirti being reborn into this world, but it's also true metaphorically. It's true for us in daily life. So the question we should be asking ourselves as we engage in politics, however we choose to engage in politics, is how can I be a light in the darkness? How can I extinguish that darkness and not be drawn into the stupidity of this Saha world, thus saving all sentient beings from suffering? Amitabha. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. So now we'll begin our question and answer period. It looks like we already have one from Daniel. Could we hear a small summary of the Nirvana Sutra later? I do plan on covering the Nirvana Sutra during our meditation and sutra studies class. That class, for those who aren't aware, is done on this channel. It happens every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. So different day, same time. Right now we're covering the Vimalakirti Sutra, but eventually we will get to the Nirvana Sutra, in which we talk more about the teaching of universal Buddhahood, Tathagata Garbha. And we also learn more about the Buddha's final days before he passed into parinirvana. Another question. And also, just so you're aware, Daniel is also a Dharma teacher. He's a minister in the Chan Buddhist tradition. And he also just published a book, I believe, Sharpening the Mind. I bought a Kindle copy. It's available on Amazon. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us. I appreciate it. And he asked, does Sangha organization count as politics? Well, it depends on what you mean by politics. When I looked at the definition of politics in the dictionary, when I was preparing for this talk, politics was described two ways. One, it was voting and the elevation of political figures, which is what we normally think of politics. It was also described as the politics of power. So the transfer of power from one group to another. So sometimes you'll hear people on the left say everything is politics because there's always a power dynamic involved. So in that way, I think we wouldn't be incorrect to say that Sangha organizations can also be very political. We are human beings, and we do try to elevate ourselves sometimes, though Buddha tried to negate that fact. So yeah, Sangha organizations can be political, and everything I said earlier also applies to the Sangha as well. Allison says, very helpful. Thank you. You've been working on this work of not generating yet more hate. And yeah, it's difficult work. Thus the fourth tenet of the Bodhisattva vows, or the fourth Bodhisattva vow, I should say. We're human beings. We have greed, anger, and ignorance. We have physical bodies. But we also have Dharma bodies. We also have Buddha nature per the Lotus Sutra. So our practice then in my view, is withdrawing into the Pure Land, into our spiritual place, and sort of recharging our battery, if you will, preparing ourselves to go back out into the Saha world, whether that's politics, whether that's washing dishes, whether that's work. So we gird ourselves in the Dharma, and then we go out. And if we do that, if we engage in that cycle, it can stop us from, like you said, creating even more hate. And it's a challenging practice, but we know it can be done. People have been doing it successfully for 2,600 years. And we have all the same tools that they do. Let's see. Barry said the coyote story was a great analogy. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I'll be honest, I did not realize the importance of that event until several months later when I was thinking about it. And then a lot of things suddenly came into play. Ad Merlin says, Namaste all. Thank you. Vera Gay Dude, sorry if I mispronounced that, said, what do that kanji in the back mean? So this is a Nembutsu scroll. You'll see this if you go into Pure Land Buddhist temples. Generally, they'll have a scroll like this. And it means Namu Amida Butsu, or I take refuge in Amida Buddha. So it wasn't uncommon for people to use scrolls like this as a focus of their practice. So I'm very fortunate. I have the scroll and I have the altar. I need all the help I can get. So, but yeah, that's what that is. That's a Nembutsu scroll. That means Namu Amida Butsu. And then blah blah says Namu Amitofu. Namu Amitofu. Thank you. Let's see. Opinion on Theravada metaphysics. That question came from Daniel. So metaphysics in general in Buddhism is an interesting question because we in the West are very science-oriented, which I think is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We're very materialistic in a way. We'd like to be able to see and touch things. So when it comes to metaphysics in general, you know, we have Theravada metaphysics, we have Vajrayana metaphysics, we have Mahayana metaphysics. You'll hear me talk about Pure Lands and Mila and Bodhisattva, rebirth. My view on this is we should read this the same way we read a newspaper. Now, if it helps us to take this as something that's literal, we should take it literally. If it helps us to take it as a parable or an allegory, we should take it as a parable or an allegory. So I actually wrote an article about this at my blog, The Same Old Zen, answering not specifically Theravada, but just metaphysics in general in Buddhism. How do we deal with them? And that's my view. If it makes more sense to you to see this as an allegory or a metaphor, take it that way. If it helps you more to think of it as literal, then take it that way. Some people think we should just get rid of the metaphysics altogether. I believe that's a mistake. Frankly, the more you read the sutras, frankly, they stop making sense if you don't include the metaphysics in them. So I include the metaphysics, but I use the caveats I stated earlier. Book recommendations. You're kind of putting me on the spot there. Let's see. I personally believe that everyone should read the sutras. So that begs the question, then what sutra should we start with? I think for people beginning in their practice, the Dhammapada is a good book to read. I also think the Vimalakirti Sutra, which we're studying now in the meditation and sutra study class, is good because it has a strong focus on lay practice. So you'll be able to grab hold of it very quickly. Some of the other sutras are a bit more metaphysical, and they talk a lot about Buddha lands and pure lands and things of that nature. And there's a lot of metaphysics in the Vimalakirti Sutra, but I think it's a good starting point if you want to get into the canonical Buddhist texts. Siddhartha Bahesi is also good. I wrote a book on the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, perfectly ordinary Buddhist teachings for everyday life. I think that's also good if we're just starting out, just because the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddhism are really the core of Buddhist teachings. If we understand them, we really understand all of the Dharma, because it all either branches from the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, or it leads into them. So that's a good starting point as well. Let's see. I think what I'll do, instead of trying to pull books out of the air, is that I'll just write an article on my blog. The same old Zen, where I list out probably about 10 books that have been really instrumental for me in my practice. Then I'll also list out some of the sutras I think would be good to start with. But again, if you're wanting to get into Buddhism, I really can't recommend the canonical Buddhist teachings, the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, the Srimala Sutra. I can't recommend them enough. Even if you don't necessarily understand all of it the first time around, just having that basis will help you make sense of everything else. Favorite modern and antique monk. So this is coming from historian DSDASD. That is a very good question. So modern day monk, someone who's alive today, I highly recommend Bhante Sudaso. He is a teacher at Buddhist Insights, and he has a monastery. I believe it's called Open Cloud Monastery in New Jersey. And I sat a retreat with Bhante about 2 years ago, and it was truly fantastic. He is ordained both in the Zen tradition and the Theravada tradition. So his knowledge of the sutras is encyclopedic, and they actually have their own channel. If you look up Buddhist Insights or Bhante Sudaso, SUDDHASO, you'll find their channel. And like I said, I really can't recommend him enough. Ancient monk. That's a rough one. I'll just name a couple that I like. Vimalakirti wasn't a monk, but I really enjoy his teachings just because even though he was a layperson, he was deeply realized. And because his focus was so much on how do we practice Dharma in daily life, I find that his teachings are just very easily transferable for people who have houses and jobs, etc. So I'm a big fan of Vimalakirti. I also am a big fan of Shinran Shonin, who was a monk, and then there's a long story, and then he wasn't a monk due to the politics of his time. And again, I like the teachings of Shinran Shonin because he, again, has a big focus on Buddhism in daily life. He taught the Nimbutsu chant, Namo Amida Butsu, and his practices were very devotional, so they may be hard to swallow for some people. He believed that it was impossible to practice Buddhism given the defilements of his day. So he taught his followers to chant Nimbutsu and place their faith in Amida Buddha. They could realize enlightenment that way. But I like his teachings because I like the fact that he was so big on the teaching of grace, that everyone, regardless of their station in life or where they come from, is a Buddha, that everyone has the ability to be reborn in the Pure Light. So I love Shinran Shonin. Let's see. Also, Zen Master Dogen, who was the founder of the Soto Zen Buddhist school. Even though I'm not a Soto Zen practitioner, I am a fan of his because he placed a strong focus on practice, and he did a good job of explaining why the practices were important. So why do we do this chant? Why do we sit? Why do we give offerings, etc.? So his writings in Shobo Genzo have been very powerful for me. And finally, I'll do one more. Dainin Katagiri, Zen Master Dainin Katagiri, who was also a Soto Zen priest. His teachings were also very important to me as well. I think he did a good job of taking canonical Soto Zen practices and explaining them in a way that Westerners can understand. Let's see. Avera G. Dude, there is a charming Pure Land Buddhist with a channel. Would you do a collaboration with him? I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that. Allah Kala, I believe that's what it is. I'm not familiar. However, I would be happy to collaborate with anyone. I love working with other teachers and discussing the Dharma. So I think that'd be wonderful. Are you familiar with the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, part of the Hinduism, but still insightful? And that came from Divad Buddha X. I've not studied the Upanishad or the Bhagavad Gita. I've talked with other people in Vedic traditions who have studied those texts, and there does seem to be a lot of crossover there. So I do think they are insightful, but I personally have not studied them. No. Okay, let's see. Any other questions? All right, well, it looks like that's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. Our next Dharma study will be this coming Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Same day, same time. 1 second, I'll look up the date. January 24th. I haven't figured out where a discussion topic will be, but as soon as I figure that out, I'll let you guys know. If you'd like to take part in the Meditation and Sutra study class, again, that takes place on Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. Same channel, different day, Wednesday, but at the same time. We're covering the Vimalakirti Sutra currently, and the practice there will consist of a 15-minute guided meditation, followed by a Dharma talk, and then we'll have a Q&A, same as this one. David Oliver, thank you. I hope to join you Wednesday at 6:30. Well, I'd love to have you, David. Thank you for joining me today. Ad Merlin says, thank you so much. Barry Kreitz, thanks, great talk. Wonderful. I'm really glad you guys enjoyed this. This is only my second time doing this class, and I'm very happy with the turnout. I'm very happy with your questions. As a Buddhist minister, it's great to see so many people who are taking the Dharma so seriously. If you do have things that you would like me to discuss in future trainings, things that happened in the media or in generally that you'd like me to discuss, things you have questions about, you can email me at sameoldzen@gmail.com or just leave a comment in the comment section below. I do take requests, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you're watching this after the live stream and you have additional questions, again, leave questions in the comment section, and I promise I'll respond. Avera G. Dude says, great talk. By the way, I loved it. Oh, thank you. I appreciate your response so much. You also said, by the way, should we call you Osho as some Zen masters do their masters? Would be cool. That's a very good question. Sensei is fine. Thank you. Sensei just means teacher in Japanese, but I appreciate what you're saying, but Sensei is preferred. Thank you. And then Vegan Puff says, I recently found your channel and have really inspired me to look into Buddhism. I will be buying your book as well. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Vegan Puff. That's incredibly kind of you. I love to hear what your thoughts are on the book, and I hope it helps you very much. So thanks for that. All right. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I'll see you on Wednesday. And if not Wednesday, I'll see you next Sunday. Amitabha.